The sun dipped below the horizon. A fiery glow spread across the sky. Orange and pink hues painted the peaks of the Trinity Alps. The air was cool and crisp. The scent of pine needles filled the air. Hannah and Jake worked together. They assembled their tent. Their laughter echoed through the trees. They had been planning this trip for months, a chance to escape the city, a chance to reconnect with nature. The Trinity Alps stood tall around them, ancient and majestic. The forest floor was a carpet of soft pine needles. A campfire crackled nearby, casting a warm glow on their faces. The flames danced in the darkness, casting flickering shadows on the surrounding trees. They sipped hot chocolate from their mugs, enjoying the peace and quiet. The stars twinkled above them. A million tiny diamonds scattered across the sky. The air was filled with the sounds of nature, the chirping of crickets, the distant hoot of an owl. They retreated to their tent, exhausted from their journey. They snuggled into their sleeping bags. The warmth enveloped them. They drifted off to sleep, content and happy. Hannah woke with a start. Her heart pounded in her chest. She listened intently. Something wasn't right, a whisper, faint and indistinct. It seemed to come from just outside the tent. The tent flap fluttered slightly. A cold draft of air seeped in. Hannah shivered. She snuggled closer to Jake, seeking his warmth, his comfort. She gently shook his shoulder. "Jake," she whispered urgently. "Did you hear that?" Jake mumbled in his sleep. He pulled his sleeping bag tighter. He didn't stir. Hannah lay awake, listening to the sounds of the night. The whispers continued, intermittent and elusive. They seemed to be everywhere and nowhere at once. "You were just tired," Jake said, his voice laced with amusement. He handed her a steaming mug of coffee. "The wind plays tricks on you out here." Hannah took a sip of the hot coffee. The warmth spread through her body. She tried to shake off the unease. "I guess you're right," she conceded, but her voice lacked conviction. Jake laughed. "Don't worry, city girl," he teased. "It's just us and the squirrels out here." He pulled her close. "Nothing to be scared of." Hannah forced a smile. She wanted to believe him. But deep down, a sense of foreboding lingered. The whispers echoed in her mind. They hiked through the forest. Sunlight dappled through the trees. The air was fresh, invigorating. Hannah tried to focus on the beauty around her. They reached the summit. A breathtaking view unfolded before them. Miles of rolling hills, covered in a tapestry of green. Hannah took a deep breath. For a moment the unease lifted. She felt a surge of exhilaration. This was why they came here, to reconnect, to find peace. But as they made their way back down, a prickling sensation ran down Hannah's spine. She couldn't shake off the feeling of being watched. The sun began its descent. Shadows stretched, reaching out like long fingers across the forest floor. The air, once warm and inviting, grew colder. A chilling breeze whispered through the trees. Hannah and Jake walked in silence. Their earlier joy had evaporated, replaced by a growing sense of unease. The forest, once so welcoming, now felt oppressive, threatening. Hannah reached for Jake's hand, her fingers intertwining with his. She needed his reassurance, his strength. He squeezed her hand gently, trying to project an air of confidence he didn't entirely feel. They reached their campsite. The once cheerful fire had dwindled to a few glowing embers. The tent stood in the gathering darkness, a lonely sentinel in a sea of shadows. They sat in silence, the only sound the crackling of the dying fire, each busy with their own thoughts, each trying to ignore the growing fear that coiled in their stomachs. Jake tossed another log onto the fire. Flames erupted, momentarily pushing back the darkness. He tried to break the tension. "Remember that time we got lost in the city?" he asked, forcing a laugh. Hannah managed a weak smile. "That was hardly the wilderness," she replied, her voice barely a whisper. Her gaze darted around the darkening forest, her senses on high alert. The fire crackled and popped, casting dancing shadows on the surrounding trees. Hannah swore she could hear whispers in the flames, whispers that sent chills down her spine. A low growl echoed through the trees, deep and guttural. Hannah froze, her blood ran cold. "What was that?" she whispered, her voice trembling. Jake grabbed the flashlight, his heart pounded in his chest. He shone the beam into the darkness, but the light seemed to be swallowed by the shadows. The forest held its breath, waiting. "It's probably just an animal," Jake said, trying to sound brave. But his voice wavered, betraying his fear. Hannah's grip on his arm tightened. Her nails dug into his skin. The growl came again, closer this time, more insistent, more menacing. Hannah's breath caught in her throat. She couldn't breathe, she couldn't move. And then she saw it. A figure, standing silently at the edge of the firelight. Its eyes glowed an unnatural white in the darkness, staring at them. Hannah gasped. Jake swung the flashlight towards the sound. The beam illuminated the figure for a fleeting moment. It was tall and skeletal, its skin stretched taut over its bones. The figure took a step forward. Its long, bony fingers reached out towards them. Hannah screamed, a primal scream of terror that ripped through the stillness of the night. Jake pulled Hannah behind him. His heart hammered against his ribs. He raised the flashlight like a weapon, but it was too late. The figure lunged. The fire sputtered. A log shifted, sending a shower of sparks up into the night. The flames dwindled, casting flickering shadows that danced and twisted around them. Fear hung heavy in the air, thick and suffocating. Hannah shivered, pulling her thin jacket tighter around her. She felt a cold dread creep up her spine, a feeling that had nothing to do with the cooling night air. Her eyes darted nervously around the campsite, searching the darkness beyond the firelight. Jake tried to maintain a calm facade, but his heart pounded against his ribs like a drum. He couldn't shake the feeling of eyes on them, watching, judging. The forest felt different now, alive and malevolent. And then it began. A low, guttural chanting, barely audible at first, rose from the depths of the forest. It was a sound unlike anything Hannah had ever heard, ancient and primal, sending chills down her spine. Hannah and Jake scrambled to their feet, their eyes wide with terror. The chanting grew louder, weaving its way through the trees surrounding them. It was a chorus of voices, but not human, something otherworldly and deeply unsettling. Jake fumbled for the flashlight, his hand shaking. He flicked it on, the beam cutting through the darkness, but the chanting seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. The forest held its breath, the air thick with anticipation. And then they saw it. At the edge of the firelight, partially obscured by the shadows of the trees, stood a figure. It was tall and slender, its form shifting and wavering in the darkness. Two glowing embers burned where its eyes should be. Hannah gasped, her hand flying to her mouth to stifle a scream. She clutched at Jake's arm, her fingers digging into his skin. He could feel the tremor that ran through her body, a primal fear that mirrored his own. "Who's there?" Jake called out, his voice barely a whisper. He took a hesitant step forward, the flashlight beam trembling in his hand. The chanting ceased abruptly, leaving an eerie silence in its wake. For a fleeting moment, the figure was bathed in the harsh glare of the flashlight. Its features remained obscured by shadows, but its eyes, those burning embers, seemed to bore into their very souls. Hannah felt a scream rising in her throat, a primal urge to run, to escape. And then, as quickly as it had appeared, the figure vanished. One moment it was there, a terrifying silhouette against the backdrop of the trees. The next it was gone, leaving only the rustling leaves and the unsettling silence in its wake. Hannah and Jake stood frozen, their breath caught in their chests, their eyes scanning the darkness, searching for any sign of the figure. The silence stretched, broken only by the pounding of their own hearts. A twig snapped nearby, the sound amplified in the stillness, sending a jolt of fear through Hannah. She jumped, her hand tightening around Jake's arm. The forest seemed to press in around them, the darkness alive with unseen eyes. They huddled together at the base of a large tree, their backs pressed against the rough bark, as if seeking some measure of protection. The forest had transformed from a place of peace and tranquility into something sinister, a place of hidden dangers. The canopy above seemed to close in, the branches intertwining like skeletal fingers, blocking out the stars and the moon. The air hung heavy with the scent of damp earth and something else, something ancient and unknown. Hannah looked at Jake, her eyes wide with a fear that went beyond the events of the night. It was the fear of the unknown, the realization that there were things in this world that defied explanation, things that lurked just beyond the reach of the firelight. The fire sputtered, sending sparks spiraling into the darkness. Each flicker of light seemed to reveal fleeting shapes in the surrounding woods, shadows that moved just beyond the reach of certainty. Hannah didn't dare blink, afraid that if she did she might miss something, or worse, see something she wished she hadn't. Jake sat beside her, his arm wrapped tightly around her shoulders. She could feel the tension in his body, the way his muscles were coiled tight with a fear he couldn't conceal. He kept telling himself it was just an animal, a trick of the light, anything but what his gut screamed at him. Something was terribly wrong. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig sent their hearts racing. The forest around them seemed to pulse with a life of its own, a symphony of unseen creatures and unseen evils. Hannah buried her face against Jake's chest, trying to block out the sounds, the shadows, the overwhelming feeling that they were surrounded. The night dragged on, each hour an eternity. They took turns feeding the fire, desperate to keep the darkness at bay, knowing deep down that the flames were a meager defense against whatever lurked just beyond the light. Sleep was impossible. Fear, a relentless companion, kept them tethered to a waking nightmare. Dawn arrived like a reprieve, a fragile promise of safety. The forest, bathed in the pale light of morning, seemed less menacing, but the fear lingered, a bitter taste in their mouths. They moved like ghosts, packing their gear with a frantic efficiency born of desperation. Neither of them spoke, but their eyes met, and in that silent exchange, they acknowledged the horror of the night, the shared experience that had irrevocably changed them. They moved with a single purpose, to get as far away from that place as humanly possible. The engine of their car roared to life, a sound both jarring and reassuring. As they sped down the winding mountain road, leaving the forest behind, they stole glances back, half expecting to see the figure from the night before, watching them, following them. The silence in the car was heavy, thick with unspoken words and lingering fear. They didn't need to speak to know that they had shared something profound and terrifying, something that would forever bind them to that night, to that place. The city welcomed them back with open arms, its noise and chaos a stark contrast to the unsettling silence of the forest. They fell back into their routine, trying to pretend that the weekend getaway had never happened, that the creature in the darkness was nothing more than a figment of their imaginations. But the city couldn't erase the memories. The chanting still echoed in their dreams, the glowing eyes haunted their waking hours. They were strangers in their own lives, forever marked by the encounter. Hannah found herself jumping at shadows, flinching at unexpected noises. The world, once a place of comfort and familiarity, now felt threatening, as if the darkness of the forest had followed them home. And sometimes, late at night when the city slept and the shadows grew long, Hannah could swear she felt a cold presence near her, a whisper of ancient evil that sent shivers down her spine. The forest might have released them, but it had never let them go. The highway stretched before them, a ribbon of asphalt cutting through the vast emptiness. The further they drove from the mountains, the more surreal the events of the night before seemed. Had it really happened? Or had the isolation, the darkness, played tricks on their minds? Hannah couldn't shake the feeling of unseen eyes watching them, following their every move. She found herself constantly glancing back at the tree line, searching for any sign of movement, any hint that they were being pursued. The silence between her and Jake was deafening, filled with unspoken fears and a shared sense of dread. Jake, normally talkative and lighthearted, drove in grim silence. His focus never wavered from the road, his grip on the steering wheel so tight his knuckles turned white. He tried to rationalize their experience, to find a logical explanation, but the memory of the glowing eyes, the ancient chanting sent chills down his spine. Each mile marker they passed felt like a victory, a testament to their escape from the clutches of the unknown. But the fear lingered, a dark cloud hanging over them, a constant reminder that some things cannot be outrun, only endured. Back in the familiar surroundings of their city life, the events of the camping trip took on a nightmarish quality. The bustling streets, the constant noise, the crowds of people, all seemed to fade into the background. Hannah and Jake were trapped in a bubble of their shared terror. Hannah was plagued by nightmares. Vivid and terrifying, she would wake up in a cold sweat, her heart pounding. The darkness of their bedroom seemed to hold hidden shapes. Jake found himself plagued by a constant unease. He couldn't shake the feeling that they had been marked. They never spoke of that night again, but the memory remained.